The old Emperor Claudius needed another wife, having disposed of the first four. Claudius was an interesting person. He'd come to the throne by default. He was a pretty good administrator, too. When I say he'd come to the throne by default, what do I mean? Every member of the family had died in mutual fratricide. They had killed each other. And when the Praetorian Guard entered the new palace, because two emperors had built two opposing palaces facing each other on the Palatine Hill, they found not a single male member of the emperor's household alive, but that poor old gentleman, Claudius. Well, Claudius was largely assumed to be an imbecile. And the Praetorian Guard decided to put him on the throne to have a puppet to run the empire through. But the moment Claudius, weak and trembling, sat down on the throne, he opened his mouth and did something that people had never heard him do before. He said things, and he said them without stuttering. And he said that he had feigned his imbecility in order what? Yes, to save his head. And now they found out that they had quite a capable and learned emperor. For several years, things ran smoothly for the empire, and not very smoothly at all for the emperor himself. He went through his four wives, and his fourth wife murdered her predecessors. And no competition that way. There never was a fifth one because they all knew what? To make any advances toward the emperor, she made it clear, what? Would soon result in death. The Roman philosopher, historian Seneca said, the most amazing thing about Claudius was he was free of vice. The folks couldn't figure it out. He had one wife at a time. And he actually stuck to that wife. No concubines, no male prostitutes, no drunkenness. He actually spent his time at the Senate proposing and disposing, and spent long days judging Roman citizens. And after 6 or 7 years, things became so normal in Rome that there were lots of folks who were very unhappy. Agrippina decided that it was time for her 19-year-old son to become the emperor. So what did she do with her husband? She asked him to abdicate in favor of her son, and he said no, that Nero wasn't ready. She asked him to formally adopt her son, and he said yes. And once he adopted Nero, what did you know about Claudius's lifetime? It was going to be what? Very short. Less than a month later, Agrippina fed him some mushrooms. He immediately went into spasm, and he lasted 12 hours, and he died in agony. And everybody knew what? Agrippina had done her husband in, and the Senate named the son emperor, the adopted son. Adoption was a great Roman symbol. And in fact, adoption we don't hear much about in the Old Testament, do we? But in the New Testament and in Paul's writings, we receive the adoption of sonship. Remember that phrase from Paul? That's because it was frequently the case that Roman families, great Roman families, would adopt their slaves into the household and make the slaves the heirs. It was a Roman custom that Paul was referring to. And here the custom happened right in the emperor's household. Can you imagine it? Oh, you remember this famous statement? Nero said that mushrooms must be the food of the gods because Claudius, by eating mushrooms, had become a god. Claudius would not allow worship of himself. But Nero, what? Nero immediately required it. He soon grew tired of his mother's hectoring, and she told him in public that he was only emperor because she had put him on the throne, and he was going to do what she told him to. She occupied one of the palaces and he the other. So what was his solution to this problem? Yes, he had her murdered. And had the Senate proclaim a day of thanksgiving to the gods because he had been saved from this wicked plot of this evil woman, his mother. The reason that she had been having this last fight with her son was he wanted to divorce his wife and have her put to death in favor of his favorite concubine. The mother thought that this was inappropriate, and that's how she met her death. Well, the Senate got the drift of things. If this was a person who would murder his own mother, what did they soon decide? Yes, and those senators that absented themselves from the Senate to show their dissatisfaction with him never made their way back to the Senate. They began to die and their lands be confiscated. And finally, about 2/3 of the Senate that he inherited had died. Various deaths at his hand. He emptied the treasury. All the money that Tiberius and Claudius had built up in the treasury and all the great works that Claudius had had in process fell into desuetude as Nero spent money on, what's the name of that chain of food stores in Boston? This was the great complaint against him. Bread and circus. Yes, bread and circus. He didn't like any of the palaces because the rooms were too small. And so he conceived this plot that I described last week. The plot against the city itself. And finally, he conceived of this risky idea. Now, we only have the records of those who disliked him. And so when they unanimously say that he set the fire, that he had the fire set, we have to understand that we're taking the word of those who wanted to blame him. And remember I told you he hit upon the idea of blaming the Jews, the Jewish leaders. Claudius had banished the Jews from Rome on one occasion, but the story leaked. Remember? I told you the story leaked, and the plot to blame the Jews fell totally apart, and the Jewish leadership came roaring back with the absolute story that they had nothing to do with it, and that in fact the Jewish synagogue sent this letter to the Senate Not only did the Jews have nothing to do with the fire, if you wish to know the origin of the fire, the Senate should ask the emperor. That's what the message they said to the Senate. Now this was very embarrassing, and of course there was a great outcry, and the senatorial class sensed the shift, and the Senate did something it hadn't done in several years. They sent a message to the north of Italy. They called for the legions to come to Rome. Now the emperor realized that this was a very dangerous situation. He was ruling by terror. And when they weren't terrorized enough and when they called for the legions, he began to be afraid. Therefore, to stop the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a race of men detested for their evil practices and commonly called Christiani. The name was derived from one Chrestus, who, in the reign of Tiberius, suffered under Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea. By that event, the sect of which he was the founder received a blow which for a time checked the growth of a dangerous superstition. But it revived soon after and spread with recruited vigor not only in Judea, but even in the city of Rome, that common sink into which everything infamous and abominable flows like a torrent from all quarters of the world. You recognize Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing. Nero proceeded with his usual artifice. He found a set of profligate and abandoned wretches who were induced to confess themselves as guilty. And on the evidence of such men, a number of the Christians were convicted, not indeed on any clear evidence of having set the city on fire, but rather on account of their sullen hatred of the whole human race. They were put to death with exquisite cruelty, and to their sufferings Nero added mockery and derision. Some were covered with skins of wild beasts and left to be devoured by ravenous dogs. Others were nailed to crosses. Numbers of them were burned alive. Many, covered with inflammable pitch and oil, were set on fire to serve as torches during the night. At length, the brutality of these measures filled every breast with pity. Humanity relented in favor of the Christians. All right, now when did all this happen? This was the year 64 AD. Now, to what event were Christians generally looking at this time? What were people expecting at this time? Why? Who said that? Some of you won't see death to the coming of the kingdom of God. What else? Huh? Well, Paul says in many of his epistles that the end is near. What else? What other reason might they have had for this? He gives the Corinthians counsel to do certain things on the basis of the fact that time is short. What else? What was the great indicator? Especially in 64.
This generation will not pass.
This generation will not pass. Yes. Oh, back in the 1880s and 90s, Adventists used to worry about that phrase, right? Because they took the phrase out of context. And every so often, we heard about somebody who was 140 years old and had seen such and such. Let's look at the context again in Matthew 24. I want to remind you, Matthew 24 is the longest of the eschatological sermons. It's paralleled in Mark and Luke. Be reminded of the event here. The first verse of Matthew 24 is the key. Jesus left the temple. and was going away when the disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Why were they pointing out the buildings of the temple? Because of this temple, the largest temple in the world. Right? 180,000 men working on it still. "47 years in building and not complete." Something that Herod the Great had conceived and to please the Jews and play the role of the son of David, and that had long outlived him, right? And had become part of the foundation of the Roman world, the Jewish temple, economically and socially, right? So that when he said, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be here one stone on another that will not be thrown down." What does that mean? What is that about? What is it about?
The end of the world.
Well, what was Jesus predicting?
Jerusalem and the end of the world.
Well, no. He was not describing both, but we must understand the disciples. He said, "There will not be left here one stone on another that will not be thrown down." Speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem, they, seeing what they saw, equated that with what? They had to equate it with the end of the world. What else could possibly be referred to but the end of the world? Right? To destroy a complex so massive, an edifice not only of Judaism but of the empire itself, would mean what? Remember, this temple was the largest thing ever built. It rested there not only on the authority of Judaism and by order of God, but the emperor's edict had created it. They heard the end of the world, and so they said, verse 3, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming in the close of the age?'" What happens there? Those are what? When will this be? What will be the sign of your coming in the close of the age? Or how many questions? Well, in their minds, they think they're asking one question. What if they really asked? Two. Now, what could our Lord have said? Some would say, should he have said? We always want to improve on it. Make yourself clearer. What could he have said? Because, no, wait a minute. You've totally got it confused as usual. I didn't say anything about the close of the coming and the end of the age, but I'll talk about that. But first I want to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of Judaism. That'll happen first, and then there's 20 centuries or so before the next thing. But I want you to get the sense of urgency that I'm going to describe here so that you'll hurry and preach my gospel to all the world. But there are those 20 centuries in between. And how would that have worked? Historically, that would have been fine, and psychologically what? That would have been ruinous. What did all the disciples expect? The coming of the Messianic age when? Right then. And so in this context, Jesus describes the destruction of Jerusalem and indeed all these sorts of things. Verse 4, Jesus answered them, "Take heed that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is the beginning of sufferings or tribulations." Look, when did this happen? When did this happen? Oh, after 1798. Oh. What's Jesus describing? Were there earthquakes in many places and famines and so forth? Claudius was actually beside himself. Why? He had to defer some of his greatest works because of the tremendous natural upheavals in the eastern half of the empire. Do you remember what Paul had to do in trying to solve the rift between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians? What did Paul do? He organized in the churches under his control, and I mean the churches under his control, he organized what? A great relief offering for the Jewish churches. Why? Because the famine had been especially severe in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. Yes. And how did the Christians see these things when they happened? These repeated convulsions that the emperor's family brought on the empire all by themselves. Most of the wars in Paul's lifetime, listen to this carefully, there was a succession of about 20 wars in the Roman Empire in Paul's lifetime. Most of those 20 wars were caused by what? Internal strife in the emperor's family. Right? They seem to trip up their own administration by their own weaknesses. Okay. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. How does this comport with the description of Tacitus that I read? How does it compare? Do you see the same thing? Yes. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And when he said the end, what did they hear? What did they hear? The end of the world, yes. And so he tells all these stories about urgency and preparation. And it's in this context that we hear, this generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. Now, what was in the Jewish mind, what was a generation? And where did they get that from? Actually, a generation in real life in Judaism was much shorter. Why? Because in reality, what happened? They married when? What was the Jewish way? They married as teens, so that a generation was 20 or 25 years at most. But where did they get this 40-year theory from? Yes, from the wandering in the wilderness. The generation of Moses, 40 years before they entered Canaan, became a theological symbol, so that when they heard Jesus say, this generation won't pass, what did they hear? They heard 40 years. Now, the chronology of Jesus and his ministry is much argued over, but we have a very definite chronology in Adventism because of the 70 weeks in Daniel 9. What year do we say Jesus died? What? 31. Yes. And so we run out the 70 weeks based on the decree of Artaxerxes in 457. We run them out in what year? 34. Now, if Jesus died in 31, when were these words spoken? What year were these words spoken, Virginia? Well, this was just before his death. So, what year is it? Well, 31, according to our Adventist understanding. And what's what then would be in the Christian's mind popularly? 31, you add 40 years, what? 71. Before 71 AD, what did they expect? Was anybody watching the clock? Paul refers to a number of these things. You know, Paul says, according to my gospel, on a few occasions. Do you remember that phrase? To whom was Paul speaking, and in what categories? Was he speaking primarily to Jews or Gentiles? Gentiles. That's very clear. Now, in the Gentile world, who did he address primarily? We say Greco-Roman all the time. Greco-Roman, right? But the thought categories were which peoples? The thought categories were which peoples? Greek or Roman? Greek, yes. The Romans conquered the Greeks so that the Greeks what? Could inject Greek culture into the Romans. Yes. Now, I've commented on this on a number of occasions. I'm going to say it again. The Gospels. Which is the gospel of Judaism? Where is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? Where is Jesus a rabbi? Where is Jesus absolutely a Pharisee? Where is Jesus absolutely the very essence of Judaism and discussing Jewish problems, interests, and concerns almost exclusively? Where is that? That's Matthew. Where is Jesus a Roman? Acting, speaking Latin, using Latin terms, acting as the ideal Roman leader would, fitting the classical mold of the Roman citizen and the Roman leader. Where is Jesus constantly moving, hardly ever speaking, but just decreeing, running from one place to another, immediately this and suddenly that, and therefore he did this, and this command he gave, and on and on and on, breathlessly, till you can hardly keep up, and it makes you tired to read the gospel. It just makes you tired because he's rushing around doing so much. What gospel is that? The Mark. Now, where does Mark come from? What's the origin of Mark? What? It's Roman. Whose gospel is it? Mark's, John Mark, the assistant of Peter and Rome. It's very figure. Now, which is the gospel where Jesus is the Greek philosopher, where he speaks and teaches constantly? Which is the gospel that has more teaching than anything else? Stories like the prodigal son. Wouldn't you expect a story like that to be in all the Gospels? But what? Many such stories found where? Only in Luke. Yes. In Luke, Jesus is the ideal teacher, the ideal social philosopher. He fits the mold of the Greek ideal. The person who is the perfect blend of the opposites. Yes. And if you want to know what Paul taught about Jesus, how Paul presented Jesus, and you see the greatest number of parallels of quotations between Paul referring to Jesus and what? The portrait that Luke draws of Jesus in Luke. Luke was created for the Pauline churches as a way of teaching the Pauline churches about Jesus. If you want to know what it was that Paul's churches learned about Jesus, you read the Gospel of Luke. That's why there's such a close correspondence between the Gospel of Luke and so many of Paul's epistles. Okay? Now, Luke also has this long eschatological sermon where it's even more clearly directed toward the end of the world being the destruction of Jerusalem in Luke 21. Even more clearly blended together. Of course, Luke has to do a little more explaining because Luke has much less Jewish content in it. What year was it? What year was it? 64. 64. By what year did they expect the end of the world? By that year. Because Jesus didn't say a full generation. He said what? This generation will not pass until all these things are fulfilled. By what year? 71. This was the summer of 64. Now, what was one of the last things that was referred to here? Verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false Christs and prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So, when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, 64. What happened in 66 AD, less than 2 years later? This was the summer of 64. What happened in the spring of 66, less than 2 years later? What? Well, yes, the Nero continued with his reckless policies after this great persecution of Christians. And the Neronian persecution, the believers saw as what? As the fulfillment of this prophecy. You see? Nero continued with his self-destructive policies. And there comes a point when even a dictator can't be abided by. And there comes a point when people say, I'd rather die. Okay, he's going to kill us. I'd rather die than what? Than continue with it this way. And it seems that the tide turned, and finally the Senate had it. And they called the legions for the north to come down. And this time they didn't relent when he sent them a threatening letter. They sent him a threatening letter back to stay in the palace. Not to leave the palace. What did he know? He knew it was over, and he knew that the one thing he better do would be what? Leave the palace. So he fled. But he was on his way to Greece, but he didn't get even to the port before they found him. One of his slaves kindly hid him, but they found him. And when they found him, what did he know? Yes. So he committed suicide, or at least as close to suicide as he could get, given who he was. He had a dagger and he was going to kill himself. But according to the witnesses, he tested the point first with his finger. And what did he find out? It was disconcertingly sharp. So he couldn't do it, and finally he asked his slave to kill him, which is pretty as close to suicide as you can get, because he knew it was going to be better than what was coming. Instantly, the three Roman armies, the one that was on its way to Rome because of Nero's outrages, and the one in the east to protect the Eastern Empire, and the one in Africa to protect the South, all had a solution to the problem. They all named their general emperor. And what did that result in? Now the Roman world was really convulsed because now there were three great power centers and three emperors with three huge armies clashing, and the Jews of Judea saw their opportunity, and what happened? Judea claimed freedom, and all Palestine was in an uproar of revolt immediately. When was this? This was when? In 66, in the spring of 66 AD, less than 2 years later, and when Judea was alighted, the last of the miserable Roman governors rushed the main body of his troops to Jerusalem. It was Passover season, and what happened therefore? The city was surrounded within the holy place by Roman legions. But of course, those legions were needed to fight other Roman armies. So they were soon withdrawn, and when they left, what did the Hebrew Christians do? Well, the Roman armies went west. They had to get to Caesarea and get on ships and head for Italy. And when the Roman armies went west, what did the Christians do? They went east to the mountains of Transjordan, where there remained a large Jewish Christian church till the 7th century AD that originated in this event. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Yes. Yeah, all right. Some folks today live in places where there aren't any mountains to flee to. Some folks live where there are more populated mountains than where they live. But this was a very... I know that the Adventist ideal is to flee to the mountains. I know that. I know it's not as practical as it was for those first Christians. Let us say that something like that, analogous to that, will occur. Okay? All right. Now, when Paul was writing these last prison epistles, and he was so worried about Timothy's shy and shrinking personality, I know that one thing that gave him comfort, because he mentions it, is while he's leaving these churches in the care of Timothy, he knows that it won't be what? Won't be too long. So Timothy should be able to do what? Timothy should be able to do what? Take care of these churches for what? For a little while, right, till the Lord comes. And according to the very earliest tradition, Timothy did take care of these churches till he died in his late 80s. But that isn't what Paul had in mind at all. No. And his great concern as he faces death at the hands of Nero is that during this great time of tribulation that they're going to face, what? Timothy just won't be able to be strong enough to give the leadership that's going to be required. And he keeps urging Timothy what? Not to be shy. Was Paul himself shy? What?
No.
No? No. Yes. Yes, yes. No, he was not a... Even in his youth, breaking on the scene, what is he doing? The Christian sect is broken out in Damascus. What does he do? As someone with the wealth and the power of one of the 200 families in the Roman Empire that had citizenship, taking his seat that's owned by his family on the Sanhedrin, he doesn't hesitate to go to the chief priest and say, what? I want letters to Damascus to go get these people. He was already an apostle. He just didn't know for what yet. All right. He's also concerned about the ever-present heresies that the church has to face. Right? He warns especially about involvement in myths, particularly the syncretistic Greco-Roman Jewish myths. Is that a danger for the church today? There's always somebody making up some new theology about the end of the world. Yeah. And that was rampant in Paul's time, because a sense of the end of the world breeds that, doesn't it? Yes, indeed. And that was one of his great concerns as he wrote. All right, we'll pick it up there. Thank you very much.